Every team, every topic, everywhere. This is Believe.
Welcome to the Sci-Fi Side, a podcast about Black science fiction, fantasy, and staying on the same page in this wonderful, pleasurable, stupefied by you. Name that movie. Can't even do it. A Beautiful Mind. Relationship. I'm one of your co-hosts, Amber Wallen.
And I'm Ben.
Welcome to episode 23 of the Sci-Fi Side. Today we have read a life-changing book. I'm not even being dramatic. I am dramatic, but this is for real. A life-changing book called The Dark Fantastic, written by Ebony Elizabeth Thomas. Before we get into the book, Ben has to make a public apology to me about last week's episode because I think I was right about Captain Marvel, even though you dragged me.
Captain Marvel is both a DC and Marvel character, so I was wrong. I apologize.
Oh, say it one more time.
I was wrong.
One more time.
3 words that will save your marriage. I was wrong.
We love to see it. All right. Well, anyway, we are going to get into this new book, The Dark Fantastic, which really focuses on something called the imagination gap, which I was not aware of before I read this book. Ben, can you sort of unpack what the imagination gap is?
Yeah, it's basically an experience where children of color, specifically Black children, can't imagine themselves out of any other role besides being like a slave or living in 1915's, Jim Crow era. And this sort of has some serious consequences when kids can't imagine themselves as flying on fire-breathing dragons and, flying through spaceships. And there's some unintended consequences. So it sort of deals with that.
I had to, a book is good when you find yourself like picking it up and then putting it down because you're just so sad because you're like, wow, she just read my whole freaking life. Like this explains so much why I avoided science fiction for so long.
The other reasons I wanted to read this book was that the cover is just so beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful covers that we have. We have kept all our covers really, really neat and organized, but a few days ago, Amber, I picked up our book, The Dark Fantastic, hardcover. It has this little girl with this futuristic Agbada holding out her hand to a hummingbird. Absolutely stunning. But there were some coffee stains on the cover, Amber. So I was wondering.
That was you.
Well, it can't be me because I have only been reading this book in the evening. You've been reading it in the morning. So therefore, you spelled some coffee.
Imagination, which is what Ebony Elizabeth Thomas talked about in this book. I want you to imagine a world where you drink coffee at night. I actually don't think that world is that hard to imagine.
Regardless, I think that the cover of this book is absolutely beautiful and one should not be drinking coffee while they read it. Or take off the jacket at least. I
agree. But you're still to blame. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more about this incredible book. I literally have just a list of quotes from this book that will be, one day tattooed all over my body. But for now, they're on this Google document. Ben, why don't you tell people why we decided to read a book of sort of like that's not so much a story as it is an analysis? Like, why did you choose this book? Because you are basically who puts all of our reading list together, and you do a great job. You're, that's the one thing you're good at in this household. So why don't you tell the people why you chose this book?
I think there's more than one thing that I'm good at besides choosing books. But to that point, I'm going to go to, we wanted to read an academic book. So this book is a collection of essays that Dr. Thomas has been working on for a while. There's a lot of thought that goes into it. So I wanted to read something a little bit academic, but the beautiful thing about this book is that it's also biographical. So she puts a lot of her own experiences inside of it. And I think this idea of the imagination gap, specifically dealing with children, was so powerful. And I kept on thinking as I was reading this, that this entire podcast is us addressing the imagination gap because her focus is on science fiction and fantasy. And I was just curious, Amber, like whose responsibility is it to address this imagination gap? Is it the editors? Is it readers? Is it teachers? Yeah, where does the responsibility fall? And I kept on having that question over and over in my head. So whose responsibility is to?
For sure. I mean, I think it's wherever reading is going to be emphasized and taught. So I think at home it's really great, but it's so frustrating because like who gets to create and what's marketable is left to like what society or whatever. So these publishing houses, because I refuse to believe that there are Black authors that have gone to these publishing houses saying, hey, this is a book about a little Black girl who has a wand and wishes for a dog and it comes true, and a publishing house saying, no, that's not marketable. So it is the responsibility of those in publishing companies, but those people are the people who get hired for those jobs, and it just all goes back to like white supremacy and racism. So I think if you are an educator or a teacher, especially if you're teaching literature, this should be like required reading. Like every teacher that I had growing up in high school, and I had lots of different teachers, but I had only one teacher where we really read Black books, and it was my, multicultural lit teacher. And it was only because the class was called Multicultural Lit did we read that there. But all other standard lit classes, we were reading Brave New World, Heart of Darkness, all Holocaust books, which are important to read, but it's really sad when I'm going to college and reading Things Fall Apart for the first time. That was the first time I read Things Fall Apart in a freshman African American literature class.
It's funny that you mentioned Things Fall Apart, because the books that you are given that have Black writers, they're not fantastical books, right?
No,
for the
not
most
at all.
part, right? Maybe with the exception of Toni Morrison's Beloved, but for the most part, you're not given fantastical books with Black characters.
Like anybody who's a millennial right now, I would be just so jealous to hear that they read Toni Morrison in high school. I know that there's some teachers out there doing great work where Toni Morrison is now being read in high school, but I did not discover Toni Morrison through the public education system. I was deeply failed in that way. Or Octavia Butler. I didn't discover Octavia Butler, honestly, until we got married. Never heard of her before, but you were such a science fiction buff that you were like, you don't know Octavia Butler, the mother of science fiction? Not the Black mother, the mother of science fiction. Where would I have learned that? Because we don't really read anything being read fantastical in schools, period, point blank, is white authors. Frankenstein. That's in like almost every high school text.
Let's get into sort of some of the themes of this book, right? Mm-hmm. And the themes are sort of addressed through looking at 4 young adult properties. And Dr. Thomas looks at The Hunger Games, Merlin, Harry Potter, and The Vampire Diaries. Mm-hmm. So what familiarity have you had with any of those properties? So
you're saying, did I participate in any of those fandoms?
Yeah, or did you see, what did you watch from those 4? Like, how did those 4 involve?
So I definitely saw The Hunger Games in theaters, and I definitely saw all 8, I think it's 8 Harry Potter films in theaters. Like, cosplay was something I heard about maybe senior year of high school. I had no idea that was a thing that people did. But I never got to that part of fandom. I don't even know what Tumblr is, like, to this day. I never thought about those things or were introduced to those things. Like, I'm in the thick of the imagination gap. But I participated in the cultural phenomenon of people, like, reading and attending. I didn't read The Hunger Games. I definitely read Harry Potter. I think I read Harry Potter books, like, 1 through 4. And my parents weren't a household that didn't care. Like,
Wait, how do you not know of Tumblr? How did you not hear of Tumblr? In college? No?
No.
Okay, so fun story. Tumblr was one of the...
Did you have a Tumblr?
No, I think I did at one point, but Tumblr was the only way to like watch porn at my college because it wasn't blocked. It was a Christian college, so
they blocked porn in the college.
Yeah, everything else was like blocked.
We were watching RedTube, Pornhub.
No, you couldn't really access any of those sites. You had to go about it, but they didn't block Tumblr, and Tumblr was sort of a way to circumvent and watch porn. That's how I heard of Tumblr.
So, be honest with me. What is, or I guess was, because I guess Tumblr is not as relevant as it was then. What is the primary function of Tumblr? So is it like OnlyFans, where like
no,
a big function of it is the adult sex work, which I know OnlyFans is for other things, but like, was that what Tumblr was?
No, I think Tumblr was sort of like a deviant art. You know what deviant art is?
Mm-mm.
Deviant art is sort of a social media website for artists.
Okay.
Like pen or stencils or animation type artists.
Okay.
So a lot of deviant art will draw, Harry and Hermione, together, right?
Got it.
So
it's like a lot of fan art.
Yeah, a lot of fan art.
So, I mean, yeah, I was not an artist, so.
Did you ever hear of like slash fiction?
I've heard of slash fiction since we've been together, but I was like blithely unaware of all of that stuff when I was in high school.
You never read any like fan fiction? Mm-mm. No. Yeah.
I would maybe talk about it or like be like, it would be really cool if Malfoy got with Hermione and then like they fucking wrecked Harry's world. Like I would talk about it with people, but I truly did not understand that there was a whole world where people wrote that and published those stories.
That's fascinating. It's almost as if your fan fiction was like oral storytelling or oral, imagination, because that itself is a form of fan fiction.
And it's so odd because I had a huge imagination as a kid, and I'm not blaming my parents at all because my parents did a really great job of having Black art in the household, and they had Black books in the household, but because of that imagination gap, all of my Black books were Ruby Bridges' First Day of School, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, fucking Sounder. Like, it was all hyper realistic, very violent. So yeah, that is a trend that she talked about in the book. But so my parents did as best they could to integrate Black stories into our households. But I was not trying to read about, even the only American Girl doll was Addie, the slave, like she escaped slavery. So you remember the American Girl dolls? Mm-hmm. And so it's like, I want to like Addie, but I'm fucking with Felicity. Like, I don't want to be, my biggest disappointment is escaping the damn farm. So my parents did as well as they could integrating those stories, but like those stories weren't there until like the Disney Channel came around. The pages weren't there. Can I ask you a question before we move on to the next topic? You were such an avid reader as a kid. Do you distinctly remember any Black characters in any of the fantastical stories that you read?
I remember being shocked that there were like Black people when I watched Harry Potter. I was like, oh, Dean Thomas is Black?
Like in the movie?
In the movie. I didn't recognize the Black characters from Harry Potter, and when I read the books. Yeah. I was just like, oh, there's a Black character.
Me either. So she has a whole chapter about like Hermione is Black, right? I didn't read Hermione as Black because, like many people, sadly, the default is white. So whenever I'm reading a book, unless the cover is a Black girl, I'm reading it just going with the flow, assuming everybody's white. It's kind of like when you open up a Zoom meeting. I'm going through a yoga teacher training right now. And you open up a Zoom meeting, I'm going into these situations assuming that I'm the only Black person. And if I'm not the only Black person, I know the other Black girl because circles are that small. So it is always a pleasant surprise, similar to what you had going on. It's always a pleasant surprise if I see another Black person at something. Like when you walk into a meeting, you're like, oh, wait, another Black person's here. Like it's great. But you're going into most situations being like, ain't none of us in there.
Well, I think there's the reaction of surprise, but what she really delves into in this book is a lot of the feeds of that surprise being shock and anger and dismay. And she goes into this whole idea that fantasy specifically pulls you out into the secondary world. And so when you are introduced with an idea of race, for example, a Black character, it pulls you into this reality, a political reality that you're trying to escape, and therefore people respond like very violently. So a big part of this book is like these really like unbelievably toxic threads that you read. And I was just curious, when did you first learn of like toxicity on the internet, like toxic threads?
You know what? I'll say this. I'll talk a little bit about toxic unpublished internet threads, okay? You ready for this? Story time. When I was in college, I was in a sorority, as you know, and I also started talking to this guy who was a complete fuckboy who was in a fraternity. And every now and then, the internet and the computers sort of started like right on the edge of high school into college. So we weren't addicted to our phones like we are now, which is great. I remember the before times. So this guy that I dated, he would log into my computer to talk in his fraternity group chat, right? Talking in his fraternity group chat, which was, clearly not on the internet. It wasn't like on Twitter or anything. It was probably just on GroupMe, but a desktop version. And one day he accidentally forgot to log out. So, my motherfucking ass became Black Nancy Drew in this hoe. And I started looking through the thread of what these men who thought nobody was looking was saying. And I saw some just unbelievable stuff, like some very offensive, like very homophobic things, any girl who sent them pictures of their bodies, because that was like right on the cusp when we started sending nudes. All of those pictures were in the chat. Like my mind was blown. And I remember having this, I never called him out on it, but what I did was I saved PDFs of all of the stuff.
Wow.
I know, because I was like, if you ever fuck me over, like I'm going to Regina George your ass and just like,
It makes me really nervous about what you've saved from me.
No. I didn't do that. And even when he did me wrong, I was like, let me just delete this. And one of my sorority sisters was like, no, publish that shit. Like, let people. And they were even talking trash in the thread about, like, we would never let this nigga join our fraternity, blah, blah, blah. And then, the next spring, that person would cross that fraternity and I'd be like, I got the threads on my computer saying that y'all would never let him, but whatever. So it was just but that was the first time I uncovered a thread of a community that thought they were being like just niche and private, which is how Reddit threads can sort of feel sometimes. Like you're saying to yourself like, oh, I have this private little thing and this is our community chat. So that has been my only experience of like negative toxic ones. What about you? Now you got to tell me.
Well, I want to sort of unpack that a little bit, because you're talking about a private group thread where in this book she is reading specifically public Twitter threads, right? So it was almost as if this progression where people would only say things maybe in a private conversation, right? Or they wouldn't even say them out loud. Then they would say them in a private group conversation via the internet. And now it's gotten to such a point where I can actually mask myself completely and say whatever the fuck I want publicly if it's through a platform like Twitter. So you can sort of see this like progression going on. And specifically what she's dealing with is that Rue was Black in the Hunger Games.
Yep.
People hated that. And then there were some other characters in the Hunger Games that were Black. And that, for them, was really shocking, because having a Black character in a fantasy world pulled people out of this futuristic world, because now they have to think about race.
It's like in the way that I will go into these Zoom meetings and see another Black girl and be shocked and pleasantly surprised. It would be like a white person entering this chat and be like, what is this Black girl doing here? That's what I hear when people overreact and are highly racist. Like, it got to a point where, so she has a chapter in the book talking about how Rue is Black. And she puts a thread of some of the, like, the 20 worst reactions to Rue being Black from like a BuzzFeed article. And it was so bad. Like, I vividly don't remember that because I didn't read The Hunger Games. I just saw it. So I was completely protected at the time from these very negative sayings. But to read the book and hear people say like, oh my God, like, not to be racist, but now that I know Rue is Black, I don't really care about her death as much. Like, how the fuck is that not racist? You just said you literally don't care since it's a Black person that died. And you put that on the internet for people to retweet and love. Suzanne Collins, I'm pretty sure, vividly wrote in the book that like District 11 or whatever it was is a harsher district of people with darker skin. It's like, it doesn't really take a big mental hurdle to think about what the people who look and live in the harshest conditions look like. Does it? And third, it was, biracial Amandla Steinberg. So it was kind of like, this was our most tolerable black, and y'all didn't accept. I'm just being honest. Like, if it was a girl my shade, they would have actually protested the movie. Very, very, very light-skinned, biracial Amandla is the darkest person they could put in that role without, like, Hollywood crashing down in flames. It was really sad and troubling to hear.
They also do it again with Merlin, where Guinevere, who's supposed to be the most, beautiful woman in all of sort of the UK, sort of British literature, and she is a mixed character, and people just were absolutely horrified that Gwen.
Well, all of
Merlin,
the people are going to be mixed. They're all going to be mixed race, because you can't, like, if ever you're putting a black person in the role and, air quote, people didn't envision them black, they have to be biracial, because it's like putting your big toe in the water. It's like, well, they gonna be mad because she's black, but maybe if we get a light-skinned girl, maybe if we get a girl with really silky hair, they won't be as mad. It's like, no, they hate black people. They're gonna be pressed. You should have just went full throttle Lupita.
This whole Twitter feeds that she presents, we now know that exists, right? I remember not knowing it existed until I think maybe like 5 years ago. I didn't even have a smartphone until like maybe 6 years ago.
Yeah, that's why I'm so shocked that you know this Tumblr so intimately.
It was random that I found it out. I also had friends who are artists who are on these things, so it was a way to push out their art. But I remember the first time I learned about the toxicity of the internet was about Demi Lovato harshly making fun of her because she gained some weight. And I remember, I think one of my roommates told me about this, and I was like, no, really, the internet, people would do that. And I remember just going through and reading all these terrible, awful things people are saying about Demi Lovato, and I didn't know that, oh, this is a thing that exists. People are actually say these things publicly. I was like, oh,
yeah,
the internet is this place of toxicity.
And the internet is also a place where the negative voice gets amplified. The internet has this way of saying only come at me with your worst, and so that's what we gravitate towards sometimes.
Okay, so what I liked about this book, though, is...
Yeah, drive the boat back.
Besides, negative comments, right? Because we all know it exists. Negative comments exist. Mm-hmm. But what she is doing, she's saying, oh, these negative comments are reflecting how Black characters are sort of portrayed and viewed in a lot of YA literature and YA film. And so it's not just the fact that these comments exist, and it's sort of showing it as something much deeper going on. And she sort of goes through this, what she calls the dark fantastic cycle, where characters oftentimes are presented as a spectacle, and then they're treated with hesitation, and then violence is visited upon them. And then they haunt because of this violence. They haunt all the characters, and then maybe there's an emancipation, right?
So to confirm, there's this cycle that most Black characters find themselves in of first spectacle, then hesitation on part of the audience, hesitating to accept them.
I think it's a little bit of both,
okay.
Right? And then that person is treated with violence, and then haunts
their
the
ghost
rest.
comes back, right. Or something.
Right. So Rue specifically, right? Rue is the youngest character.
So spectacle.
Is a spectacle chosen for the Hunger Games. She sort of spies on Katniss and sort of treated with hesitation, and then they eventually come together, and then Rue dies this very violent death. And then her death becomes this haunting that sort of stays with Katniss and sort of drives her to win. But by the second book, Rue disappears. By the third book, she's barely mentioned. Mm-hmm. And so she never goes through that final cycle of emancipation, of having your own sort of freedom to be your own character, because Rue is defined in terms of her relationship with Katniss.
So in a lot of ways, these Black characters can't be opening scene hits the stage. It has to be oh, a Black person. Oh, do we like this Black person? Let's kill this Black person. oh, this black person is haunting me.
Yeah, and you can create like lots of different formats to see how black characters are created, but I think this format is pretty helpful, not only just seeing black characters, but also how black people are treated. It's like often I think of you like maybe coming into a show being only the black character and you being like the spectacle, but people are going to be hesitant around you. And then maybe that hesitation leads to violence. And then you might, like, your absence, if you're not there, might haunt the room. People like being fearful of like being racist, you know, and so and so you sort of miss out on being fully emancipated to be your own fully realized character. And so this framework in which she's looking at these stories are like really cool. What do you think about that, as the dark fantastical cycle being not only about the books but about real people, real black people?
This author is brilliant. Like, literally every line would just said something just so insightful. And I prefer to look critically at characters through this cycle than through tropes. Because sometimes, I mean, and those tropes are helpful, but when we think about like the magical Negro trope, right? Sort of as like what she calls like the modern day slave. It's like they're only there to help the white protagonist, and they might actually have some like magical powers. Sort of like, did you ever see like Legend of Bagger Vance?
Oh yeah, sure. Will Smith, Matt Damon.
Yeah. So, but when we think about this cycle, it lets us unpack so much more, and I think it more closely allows us to track this trend, whereas sometimes we'll be like, oh, we've identified the magical Negro. It's sort of like Bloom's taxonomy a little bit. It's like magical Negro trope for me is like we identified it. Like, here it goes, tale as old as time. But this dark fantastical cycle is like, no, this is a pattern, like how these characters are developed and written over multiple seasons. And it requires like more work on us as audience members and, you know, more tears on us as audience members. But I felt like I was taking a class that she was teaching as a professor.
You know, one of the other shows that she looks at is Merlin. And she celebrates Merlin's earlier seasons for Gwen having this power of not calling out Arthur and being like really hard and just being a powerful character. And it's funny because this also happened with Sleepy Hollow, she talks about, where you have these specifically black women characters who are introduced first as fully realized characters. They're not purely foils. They have their own backstories. And then these writers, white writers, start out with these powerful characters, but then they fail us. And specifically with Sleepy Hollow, and again with Merlin. And it almost makes me wonder, like, should white writers be even writing black characters, or just
because they write them to be unlikable, like you handle them or you mishandle them to a point where I, as a black person that typically always roots for the black person, I'm like, I don't want to be her.
That gets into a little bit of the Vampire Diaries, which we'll go to, but I shouldn't be saying, can white writers write black characters? That I think they can be doing that, but I think there's this immediate hesitation or fear that when you see a fully realized black character, especially when you're reading about them through the eyes of the author, Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, there's this fear that, oh my gosh, are we going to have this character now, this black character now, who's going to be a fully realized character? And then you realize, oh wait, that's pulled away from you. And that is like jarring and shocking and just traumatic.
I mean, and also at the end of the day, like, here's the get you got you. Can white showrunners write these fully realized characters? Maybe. Can black people write fully realized characters? Yes. Like, so it's frustrating that we are like giving these white writers time on time on time on time again, opportunity on opportunity to get these black characters right, when there are rooms full of black people that cannot get their scripts seen. And so we just keep taking chances on like, oh, maybe They got this right. It's like, how about this? How about it's the
maybe for a season or two.
Exactly. And it's frustrating because it's sort of the same dynamic with like black hairdressers and white hairdressers, right? It's like, I got black talent on this set. If you get a black hairstylist, guess what? You got somebody that can do black hair and everybody else's hair in the room. Or you can get a white stylist who likely only knows how to do white people's hair. Maybe she can do black hair, but I can promise you that a black hairstylist can do everybody's hair. There's a full dark fantastic cycle. Like, this is a field of study at this point, how many times people have fucked this up. And it's not just people fucking up. That's why the book is so dope. It's not just people fucking up, because like what you just did just shaped a black girl's understanding of herself. Like, people don't think about writers and creators like that, because it's like, you're not a doctor. When you mess up, somebody didn't die on the table. Like, you did do something. Like, you just miswrote this character and fucked with a child's psyche, and now they view themselves differently in the world. Like, why don't we sort of hold them to that same fire? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because I am the amalgamation, I'm a bad bitch, but I'm also the amalgamation of several people miswriting people, to the point where I have doubted myself and I have let this internalized like anti-blackness seep into things that I've done. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, obviously I'm doing a lot of unlearning now that I've entered my like 20s and about to be 30s, but most black people up until college are an amalgamation of all of these poorly written black characters. There's a pop group called the Spice Girls. The black one is Scary Spice. I, as a kid, am singing these songs, and Spice Girls are legendary. But I'm saying to myself, I'm scary to people. I'm walking through the world saying, what can I do to not be scary to people? Why do I keep scaring people? And then I'm learning at 20, I was like, oh, people are scared of me, and that's beyond my control. So why am I working to stop scaring people? And so writers do that exact same thing, but they need to get the shit together. That's what Dr. Thomas is saying.
You know, she has a really beautiful relationship with her niece, and her niece watch the Vampire Diaries together. And there's this like really heartbreaking scene where she talks about her niece, metaphorically choosing the doll with the blue eyes, and ends up liking the white character from the Vampire Diaries. Or there's another example where she shows Dr. Thomas shows up, has all these books by like black women authors, and her niece is like, how come you expect me to just like want to read books with like black girls in them, you know? And almost like this shocking, and it made me think of like, oh, this is an experience where my niece is experiencing choosing the doll with the blue eyes, right? And that was like really
because they gave that bitch all the accessories, all of the notebooks and pens, and the freaking Trapper Keeper, and the black Barbie got one, lead pencil. So what am I'm learning as a 4-year-old, oh, white people have more things. Why wouldn't I aspire to whiteness?
Yeah. And it's so insidious when you think about it. And then specifically the Vampire Diaries, she just goes at it, and it's like the witch, the black witch in the Vampire Diaries is completely pushed out in a way, doesn't show up to all the glamour in the party. She's not desired by other characters. It's really, really awful what this show did, and the psychological impact it will have on children, black girls specifically, growing up. Like, these shows matter. And there's this great anecdote about why don't you share that anecdote about Lin-Manuel Miranda and Biden and Will and Grace? Remember? Oh,
yeah. At one part in the book, this is obviously not everything we're saying is because Dr. Ebony just changed our lives. But there's one part of the book where Joe Biden and James Burrows, the director of Will and Grace, both go to see Hamilton. And so they have a conversation after Hamilton, and Joe Biden talks about how much he liked Will and Grace, and talked about how that show really did change how he viewed gay people and lesbian people, because he, probably doesn't know a lot of gay and lesbian people, or didn't at the time, and how that show changed how he viewed people as people. And it was just this really poignant excerpt that she had in here about how art engenders empathy in a way that politics don't. And that is, the basis of everything that we're saying today is that's why it's so important that these directors and these writers get this shit right. Because you have the ability to change. Like, now, this book was written before Joe Biden was president. But, like, arguably, I mean, there was a time where the president was one of the smartest people in the country. I'm not sure what that is now, but like, I used to view presidents as being like, you are very intelligent. You went to Harvard or Princeton or whatever. Even the ones I hated, I'm like, at least I know, your daddy paid for you to go to Ivy League school or whatever. But even some of the allegedly smartest people running the country, commanders in chief, minds are being changed from a sitcom. So think about how people's minds are being changed, of different educational aptitudes.
Yeah.
Like, there's power in that.
Most of the book is her showing how art engenders a lack of empathy. And it's really hard to read some of this because not only is she showing that specifically Black characters doing this, but she's also showing how darkness and dark things are often associated with villainy and wickedness
And like monstrous
and monstrosity. And it sort of she goes into a really personal story where she writes about being canceled. I don't think she says being canceled, but in her 20s, she was very much involved with Harry Potter fandom. And she wrote a fanfic. And in this fanfic, she used Virginia Hamilton's, The People Who Can Fly?
Yeah, she just wrote her own.
Yeah.
This was in the time before the internet where rules were probably a little different.
Right,
and
so she incorporated Virginia Hamilton's The People Could Fly in the context of the Harry Potter world. And she quoted like pretty extensively from Virginia Hamilton without properly citing, and she owns up to that, but it's fan fiction, right? And so she is anathematized and like kicked out because she's told as being like plagiarized, when all of the basis of fan fiction is to plagiarize. And it's really heartbreaking. It is like really horrific in the way that she's treated in this like violence. It was violent. And,
I agree.
And she deletes all herself. She's no longer.
She was asked to step down from conventions and panels.
It was just awful. And we started having this conversation about cancel culture and how oftentimes like cancel culture really only affects like black people,
and
right?
Specifically Black women. Like when I think about Chrisette Michele, she decided to sing at Trump's inauguration. Horrible decision, but this woman was very, very talented singer. I have even attended one of Chrisette Michele's concerts, pre-Trumpism, and she has not made a comeback since she made that decision 8 years ago, and she's being punished. Like, I mean, yeah, should you have sang at Trump's inauguration? Fucking no, but do we all shuck and jive for the white man for a check? We've all done it. So it's so insane that she is being blackballed and treated like a criminal, like she, sex trafficked and did all these things. It's like she's being canceled in the same way. And her music is not really played anywhere, or even, I think I saw an ad the other day where she was trying to drop a new song and I was like, oh my God, I remember her. It's
so sad. But it makes me think of like white people that we've heard who get canceled, right?
Yeah,
they end up
canceled.
They get to go on like conservative talk show hosts, and they get to go on speaking tours, and they write their books, and they're being pushed through like the right side of media. Where if you're Black and you do something like misstep, like maybe you can swing yourself over to the right wing media, but if you do that, you cancel out you essentially destroy a bunch of other relationships, right? Like there's no coming back. And it's just really, really damaging. It was so sad reading that story.
It's so interesting because when a white person, says something, and I'm not talking about criminals. Let's take all criminal activity off the table. I'm talking about just like you said something way out of pocket. J.K. Rowling, for example. We'll talk about J.K. for 2 seconds because, we can keep it black over here. J.K. Rowling obviously is a part of this whole turfdom, stepping out of line, being transphobic. Not only is she still gonna make her coin because of Harry Potter world and all of that, she's not gonna lose any book deals, whatever, if she's working on anything for the future. She then also is defended by other people. Other people start caping for her, which is never, I cannot remember one celebrity that stuck up for Chrisette Michele, this amazing R&B singer. But I remember Margaret Atwood jumping in the chat when J.K. Rowling was going down. Other Black authors started jumping in the chat as well. And so it's, when Roseanne Barr got caught up in some bullshit, Monique, a Black comedian, jumped in the chat to defend her. But Monique, your ass asked Netflix for more money than like Amy Schumer because you had the resume. Where was Roseanne? Was she there caping for you? It's like literally the same, when we're talking about art engenders empathy, when we see these white protagonists being helped by Black people, like Monique literally in real life was sitting here having Roseanne Barr's back for being racist. And the minute Monique was going down, have we heard from Roseanne? No. Where are all of the white girls who should be standing up for Monique? No. So it's so fascinating to me that cancel culture literally is most limited to Black people. And sadly, this incredible author.
Let's get into some of the size because she has a whole...
Oh, can I say one thing before we get into the size?
Yeah.
I think the most infuriating part of the book for me, which isn't a size, infuriating, like white people get on my nerves, is people trying to like turn up about things, like trying to mask their racism in wanting to be historical or claiming that the book is ahistorical. So they'll do like, well, Gwen was supposed to be a white lady because Black people didn't exist in the Crusades, whatever bullshit line they have. But it's like that, you remember, I walked around the house for days being so infuriated about like, but there is a motherfucking fire-breathing dragon in this show. Those were not in the Crusades either. So how is it so unfathomable for you to imagine a Black girl as a queen, which we've seen, Cleopatra and all the likes? How is it hard for you to imagine a Black person in a monarchy, but not a fire-breathing dragon? Man, explain that logic to me.
Well, she explains it, I think, really well in the book. She's saying that when you, as a white person, never are forced to think about race, never are forced to address it in any way, and you're reading a fantastical book, and it's taking you to a different world, that secondary world, and you come across something like race that is so modern, right? That pulls you out, and it's this shock, what we call, I don't know if she uses this phrase, but I'm going to call it second world shock. It's this idea in which your world that you're living with seeps into the second world in this explicit way. And so when you watch film like The Vampire Diaries or Merlin or, Hunger Games, and you see a Black character where you assumed a white person was there, you all of a sudden are just like shocked. It makes me think of, there was a Star Wars novel that was written, the first one since the reboot of the new canon, and there was like gay characters in it. And somebody wrote to the author like, I don't read fantasy to read about politics. And this idea of having like gay people in a book as being political is so reflective of the biases that we inherently bring into reading literature, because it's a political belief to assume everybody's straight, right? That itself is a political belief. And it was just so fascinating. And that's what she's sort of getting at in here, is that white people are experiencing for some of the first time second world shock.
Because now that is like, no, we are bringing you to the table to make you have a conversation about why you were so shocked. It's like one time when we met our neighbor and you came outside to greet him and say, hey, and then I came out the back of the house. I was like, hey, he was like, oh. And I heard that reaction in his voice, and I was just like, you couldn't contain your, I decided in that half a second of his react. Like he did he did a shock.
You're
and
just dark. You're just the dark's fantastic. He
did a shock. I was a spectacle, and then he skipped hesitation and went right into like hypersexualizing me. You remember when he was like, "Oh, I see what you got going on there." I was like, "I'm his fucking wife. What do you mean what he has going on there?" And now I don't fuck with him.
Yeah.
Like, and that took what, 5 seconds?
Maybe we can haunt him.
Yeah.
No, before we get to the sides, because you're saying all this stuff, I think now the book ends in a really hopeful way, right? And one of the hopeful ways is that she writes about Sleepy Hollow, where Sleepy Hollow decide to kill the main black character, Nicole Bahari, who played Abby Mills in there. And by the way, it just recently came out that Nicole Bahari was labeled as difficult to work with because she was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease.
Blackness.
Yep. And then her white, co-actor, Tom Meissen, also got sick, but he got to go off for a month and go back to England to recuperate. But sort of going into this whole idea that black women don't feel pain, right? And
there was this Thomas Jefferson quote on page 151 that said, like, Thomas Jefferson said, and he was referring to black people, their griefs are transient.
Yeah.
That just like,
and that is
radiated through my bones.
But the great thing is that Sleepy Hollow, the first season, and Tanana Reeve I heard her say like, we'll always have the first season or the first 2 seasons. Like she was a huge fan of Sleepy Hollow, but the fans and the critics rallied around this decision to kill off this amazing character, and the show was canceled a season after.
Times are changing.
Yeah, so
the internet is mobilizing and calling y'all out. So yeah, you're getting less opportunities, white writers. Shaking your boots, get sensitivity readers, or think to yourself, should I be telling this story? Did I steal this story? Maybe I should hire the person that can tell this story well.
So
that's on who? A fire-breathing dragon.
Fire-breathing dragon.
And not the black princess. So let's get into the size.
Yeah. One thing I can't stand is this whole idea where Hermione is black. Dr. Thomas sort of celebrates that idea because Harry Potter did something, and specifically J.K. Rowling did something that changed the way fandom interacted with a property. For example, J.K. Rowling embraced fan fiction and encouraged fan fiction. It wasn't sort of overly like possessive of her properties in the way that you think some authors would be, right? And H.P. Lovecraft did the same thing, right? But like H.P. Lovecraft and J.K. Rowling, there's this darker side. No.
It's like everybody can have a piece of this pie except for you niggas.
Yeah.
Except for you trans people, okay? Y'all can't get in on this. But everybody else, do your fan fiction.
Well, yeah, not only that, she doesn't go into that at all in the book, which is fine. But one thing I get a little frustrated with is that with children specifically, you need to be very explicit if you're writing about race. And even Suzanne Collins is that there were parts of the book that, Dr. Thomas would read and hold on to being like, oh, this is like the paragraph that cues me in, oh, this character's black. Or like holding on to like these small little pieces like, yes, this character is
black. Make it plain. Say it with your full chest.
Yes. And with children, that's what you have to do. We're taught as educators, be explicit with the teaching point today and constantly refer back to the teaching point. And so this like, yeah, Dumbledore was gay, sure. Like, yeah, Hermione is black, sure. Or
don't be a crowd pleaser with the shit. Like,
right.
No, we want to hear you say what it was.
Right. But there's this flip side because J.K. Rowling, in one sense, is saying, like, you as the reader own this property just as much as I do. And John Green, who wrote Looking for Alaska and The Fault in Our Stars, he wrote something that was really popularized, but he wrote, books belong to the readers, right? So if you look at major American properties, Star Wars and Harry Potter, Star Wars fanfic, like, Lucas was a dick about it, and where J.K. Rowling like embraced it, right? And I think there's a beauty in that, but there's this flip side to it where like you are being, I think, racially insensitive or just racially ambivalent when you're like, yeah, sure, like instead of like
a black girl holding her Harry Potter book, like, so like she has big hair and Muggle parents, and you know, is Hermione black? Well, what do you think? It's like, bitch, I asked you, okay. Say it right. She's doing this like, I don't want to be clocked for being racist, so I'm just gonna like not really. I'm like, well, you know, Dumbledore's gay if you want him to be gay. No, I tried to intentionally pick up on some things that you said and you wrote. Can you shed more light on it? Well, it's up to your interpretation. It's lazy.
I wish she unpacked that a little bit more. Like,
you wish Dr. Ebony.
Yeah, Dr.
Thomas.
Dr. Thomas, you know, went into a little bit more. But other than that, I didn't really have any size with the book.
Man.
It's a really
crazy.
beautiful book and helpful book, and it's going to really, I think, sort of act as a guide for us when we start having kids, you know?
For sure, Ben.
Yeah.
I agree. There were some times I honestly, you know, maybe I'm being sensitive, but for some of the statements that were made, like when she would post what, like the most violent words that white people were saying, I kind of wish there was a trigger warning for that. Like, just a little bit, because I really, you know, I was taken out, you know, I was submerged in this analysis and then taken out of the very insightful, hopeful analysis when I had to read, like, why is she black? Black people, like a page full of comments about people that hate black people. Like, I kind of needed, like, you know, like, what you're about to read is true accounts, and they are pretty, and they're hard. So I could have like skipped over those parts, but you know, maybe a part of me needed to like read it. And
I think this book sort of finds this in between to being like this personal story, but also it's very academic. And in academia, you don't put trigger warnings in academia, right? This is an academic book.
I'm a baby.
You're supposed to distance yourself. And I think that's a huge problem with academia, is this idea that we can distance ourselves from the material we're trying to unpack and discover. Like, that's just absurd. And I like that she doesn't do that. She's like, no, this is actually very personal to me. Like, I was canceled from Harry Potter fandom. I had this experience with my niece who, you know, wanted a white character instead of a black character. Like, it is a very personal story, but she mixes it with some pretty heady, you know, academic language. You know, like the term valiance is a new word that I learned.
One of my favorite things that she said, we should do like a favorite things she said moment to close out the show. But one of my favorite things she said was when she quoted Audre Lorde about how these stories like coming should be just more blackened and whole. Like, that blackened and whole really is the antithesis of the J.K. Rowling thing, right? It's like, if Hermione's gonna be black, make her blackened and whole. Like, don't do this in between shit, because us little black girls, it's only gonna be one or two of us in this motherfucker. So make her whole and black as hell. And that makes me hopeful for the future, because there are going to be more opportunities, a balance of stories. Chinua Achebe said there's going to be a balance of stories in the future, and so I'm just looking forward to that future.
Yeah, we need it because we're running out of film and TV shows too.
All right, Ben, why don't you warp up the show?
Everyone go buy The Dark Fantastic. It's a beautiful book. Not only let it sit on your shelf, but read the book as well. A quick read, it's short. Teachers, go out and buy this book. It is really going to, I think, guide you and sort of teach you how you address the stories you decide to teach to your children.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Sci-Fi Sci. Next week, we're going to watch a TV show based on a book. We will be watching Knots and Crosses. This was recommended by a listener, Hales. We love you. Knots and Crosses was written by Mallory Blackman, and it was directed by Julian Holmes, who is a white guy, but listen, and co-directed by Kobe Adom, who is a black man. So we are going to celebrate this alternate history of what would happen if black people were the colonizers and not the other way around. So really get excited. You can watch Knots and Crosses on Peacock TV. Trust me, it's free to download and it's free to watch. So we'll see y'all next week for episode 24, Knots and Crosses. Bye, y'all.
Thank you for listening to Believe. You can show support to your host by subscribing to the show and giving us a 5-star rating on your preferred platform. Check us out at Believe.com and search for BLEAV on YouTube.
Hey, Philly fans, hear the most in-depth Philadelphia Eagles coverage anywhere with Eagles Unfiltered, part of the Believed Network. Hear from Connor Miles and his co-host Rashard Cook as they break down the Philadelphia Eagles before and after every game all throughout the NFL season. Search Eagles Unfiltered wherever you get your podcast.
Every team, every topic. Do you believe?